part of this, the other part of the destruction of climate skeptics is they tell you that 97% of climate change scientists are in consensus, right? You guys have heard that statistic, right? The majority, the consensus, 97% of scientists agree. So there's a couple reasons why that's wrong. First of all, consensus does not equal being right. At one point in history, the greatest scientific minds were in consensus that the Earth was flat. That wasn't right, but they all agreed on it. So consensus does not equal something being right. And then the factoid about 97% of scientists agree. Do you know how that statistic came to be? Do you know what that's based on? No, you probably don't. Not very many people do. And not very many people ask, what is that based on? So I'm going to tell you, it's based on a group of citizen scientists. They did a study. Do you know what a citizen scientist is? An activist who doesn't want to seem political. Citizen scientists, it's a group of activists who got together and they claimed that they analyzed over 11,000, I think it's 11,900 scientific papers on climate change, on the human contribution to climate change. And they analyzed these papers and came to the conclusion that 97% of the scientists who published these papers were in agreement. But do you know how they analyzed these papers? They did a Google search within this scientific database just for the words climate change and human-involved climate change. And then they didn't read what the viewpoint of the scientist was. They just assumed that those words meant that that scientist agreed that humans are the largest contributing factor to climate change. And so they published this statistic, which has become one of the most commonly repeated statistics about climate change, and it's simply not true. A group of actual scientists got together and analyzed those 11,944 papers, and do you want to know what percent of those papers actually support the original contention that humans were the majority driving factor behind climate change? Not 97%, 0.3%. But you won't hear that. You don't hear that because the climate change criers don't want to talk about it. They don't want to answer your questions, and maybe it's easy to see why. Because when you do ask the questions, you find fatal flaws. So that brings us to reason number 4 why you shouldn't believe the climate criers. When there is something that they get wrong, when there is science that's not really science, it's pseudoscience, when they make a mistake that impacts a large prediction, they cover it up. Do you guys know what NOAA is? The National Oceanic? Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure what the acronym is, but I am familiar with it.
Okay, NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. It's a government-funded agency. It's basically government-funded meteorology and climate studies, okay? NOAA, a government agency, is known, they're known within the scientific community for fudging numbers. And I want to give you an example of this. In 2016, NOAA claimed that that year, 2016, was one of the hottest years on record. You've heard that claim, I'm sure, right? That we're experiencing the hottest years on record? That's not true. It's not true at all. In fact, 2016, the percentage of hot days in 2016 was below average. Do you know what it ranked? 80th since 1985. The percentage of hot days in the year 2016 was only 80th on the list of the years with the highest number of hot days since 1895. And they cover this up. They make this claim and they cover up the real data. How do they cover it up? Well, they adjusted their own reporting. They didn't use actual numbers, they used conjecture, not actual data that they'd collected. They adjusted their reported temperature to match almost identically with CO2 in the atmosphere. So it wasn't based on numbers that they'd measured and then transcribed and then put into a graph and then analyzed to see if it was the hottest day. They made it up. They made it up to match their political agenda.